stronger. It was the state and proto-state structures that were disintegrating. Indeed, in the early 6th century, almost the entire territory of Arabia was controlled by several kingdoms. So the Himyard kingdom in the south, which dominated not only the entire Arabian south, but also the noticeable part of Central Arabia. The second Kindid kingdom, a vassal of the Himyarids, which controlled most of Central Arabia. The Lakhmid kingdom in the Arabian northeast, so this is Lakhmid kingdom, which also controlled a significant part of northern and central Arabia and depended on the Sasanian Empire, and the Ghassanid kingdom in the northwest of Arabia, which in turn was dependent on the Byzantine Empire. So next slide. Moreover, in the territories outside the direct control of the above-mentioned kingdoms, we would usually find not tribes proper, but rather chieftains. The heads often expressly call themselves kings. Next. The situation in the early 7th century, say during the years of the beginning of the prophetic activity of Muhammad, differed from the one described above in the most radical way. All of the great Arabian kingdoms mentioned above disappeared along with the smaller kingdoms, chiefdoms. There were practically no kings left in all of Arabia, and where there were chiefdoms a century before, we would already see 3 tribes. Next slide. Let us now look at some possible causes of the 6th century Arabian crisis. Next slide. According to paleoclimatology, the 6th century saw global climate change associated with the peak of tectonic and volcanic activity around the world. The main role here was played not by earthquakes, but by another consequence of seismic activity, volcanic eruptions. Next slide. At the same time, a truly important role was played here by volcanic gases, ash, and aerosols, which were released into the atmosphere in gigantic quantities during volcanic eruptions and partially delayed solar radiation, which in turn led to the cooling of the lower layers of the atmosphere. In the climatic conditions of Arabia, the latter circumstance somewhat counterintuitively is the effect of droughts. And indeed, for the 30s and 40s of the 6th century, we have numerous evidence of famine years caused by catastrophic droughts. Next slide. At the ground level, climatic changes caused by the peak of volcanic activity associated with the 536 explosions of the Rabaul volcano on the island of New Britain near New Guinea and another volcano in the upper Yukon in Canada were described by a contemporary in relation to Mesopotamia as follows. For the same time, similar descriptions have reached us from Rome and Constantinople. The sun was dark and its darkness lasted for 18 months. Each day it shone for about 4 hours, and still this light was only a feeble shadow. The fruits did not ripen, and the wine tasted like sour grapes. Next slide. The reconstruction of the political adaptation of the Arabs to the socio-ecological crisis of the 6th century is possible through the study of the pre-Islamic historical tradition, the so-called Ayam al-Arab. Next slide. And one of the typical days can be retold as follows. A certain Arabian chief or king behaved arrogantly towards his subjects and oppressed them. Next slide. This behavior often consisted of attempts to collect taxes in years of famine, caused caused primarily by insufficient rainfall. Next slide. A typical reaction to such behavior was the murder of the chief king by his subjects. which naturally entailed attempts by the chief's relatives to avenge his murder and in fact to restore the fractured chiefdom. As a result, another Arab day began, which could last for years, filled with violent actions on both sides. Next slide. In any case, in the end, we as a rule see the kingdom or chiefdom disintegrated and free tribes already appear in its place. Next slide. In fact, all this can be seen as an important component of the Arab adaptation to the socio-ecological crisis of the 6th century. Next slide. This rather effective adaptation was basically that most of the socio-political systems of northern and central Arabia quite adequately responded to this crisis by rejecting super-tribal political structures, that is, most of the Arabian kings, political leaders of the chiefdoms and agents of their power, which began to pose a real threat to the basic survival of ordinary members of the Arabian tribes. Next slide. However, the Arabs did not simply destroy most of these rigid super-communal political structures that alienated tribal sovereignty. They also developed alternative soft structures of super-tribal cultural and political integration that did not pose a threat to tribal sovereignty. The most notable thing here seemed to be the development of a system of sacred enclaves and regular pilgrimages to them accompanied by fairs, so-called mawasim. Next slide. Although some pre-Islamic Arabian tribes managed to adapt to the crisis quite effectively, this adaptation was not universally perfect. Next slide. Let's say that the adaptation of the Arab tribes of the Mecca region turned out to be quite successful. And this is largely why Muhammad did not find enough space to develop his prophetic activities there. But it apparently was not so successful, for example, on the periphery of this area in Yathrib, a city currently known in the world as Medina, where several tribes, in the absence of any effective supra-tribal power, could not quite sort out relations among themselves. Next slide. A problem was by no means new to Arabia. And in the late 5th, early 6th century, the typical ways to solve it were quite obvious. To send envoys to one of the great kings of Arabia and ask him to appoint a king over the corresponding group of tribes, which thus essentially turned into a chieftain. Yes, next slide, perhaps. But this practice apparently became unacceptable in the 7th century. Decades of uprising, clashes, and other violent actions that led to the destruction of most of the Arabian kingdoms and chiefdoms appear to have led to the development among the Arabs of a certain freedom-loving anti-royal ethos codified in tribal historical traditions and poetry. A reflection of this ethos can be found in the Quran, which contains, say, an ayah which we reproduce below. Al-muluk is dakhalu qaryatan afsaduha wa ja'alu aizata ahliha azilatan wa kazalika yafalun, which is translated, kings when they enter a village, they corrupt it, they turn its most worthy inhabitants into the lowest. That's exactly what they do. Next slide. All this constitutes a striking contrast to the situation in a century before, when the Arabs themselves asked for kings to be appointed over them. And most Arabs, in one way or another, recognize the authority of one or another king. Next slide. In any case, in the early 7th century, a tribe that recognized itself as subordinate to any earthly super-tribal political power, the king risked losing its honor, its face. However, this did not seem to apply to another type of power, the heavenly power. Next slide. Historical facts indicate that if for most Arab tribes becoming subjects of earthly kings was absolutely unacceptable and was tantamount to a complete loss of honor, recognition of some heavenly power, naturally through its earthly representative, turned out to be quite acceptable. Next slide. Here it is necessary to take into account one more group of facts. Pre-Islamic Arabia was quite familiar with the figure of a prophet, a kahin. In any case, the average Arab apparently knew well what the prophets looked like, what a prophetic trance was, and so on. However, until the 7th century, the Arabian prophets, Kahana, were prophets of pagan deities. Next slide. Thus, their power was by no means optimal, since recognition of the power of such a prophet automatically meant recognition of the power of the corresponding pagan deity, while the cults of such deities were always tied to certain tribes, whose patrons the corresponding deities were. Therefore, recognition of the power of a given deity actually meant recognition of the power or primacy of the corresponding tribe, which is confirmed, say, by South Arabian epigraphy. Next slide. Thus, the optimal figure here could be a monotheistic prophet. However, the prophets of the old monotheistic religions also did not fully fit here, since recognition of their power would also mean recognition of dependence on the corresponding extra-Arabian powers. And in the case of Judaism, this would put in a more advantageous position those Arabian tribes that had since long ago professed Judaism. At the same time, in the pre-Islamic Arabia, there was apparently an autonomous monotheistic tradition, no Rahmanism or Hanafiya. However, its North Arabian bearers, Caliphs, apparently did not produce prophets until the 7th century. However, in the early 7th century, the Arabian prophetic tradition and the Arabian monotheistic Rahmanid Hanifi tradition apparently merged, producing what Mikhail Piotrovsky, the director of the Hermitage now, called the Arabian prophetic movement. It must be taken into account, along with Muhammad, at least 4 other monotheistic prophets, or of course false prophets from the point of view of Muslims, acted in Arabia during his era. Next slide. Perhaps we will not go in details, just demonstrating this. Perhaps we will skip this. We will skip this. Yes. Monotheistic Rahmanist prophets apparently represented supra-tribal power of precisely the type that was most acceptable to the majority of Arab tribes of that time. Next slide. It is worth noting that all of the Arabian Rahmanist prophets of the 7th century achieved significant political success in their respective areas of Arabia. All of them managed to bring under their control the tribes of vast regions of Arabia, whose territory was many times larger than the area of the average Arabian chiefdom and comparable in size to the Arabian kingdoms. Next slide. The success of the Rahmanist false prophets, of course, is not comparable to the political achievements of Muhammad, but it was still a highly significant success, the like of which was not achieved by any of the Arabian secular political leaders during this period. And this seems to show that in the 7th century, Arabia, such political success could have been achieved by a Rahmanist prophet rather than by a king. Next slide. The data presented suggests that the emergence of Islam can be considered as a completely logical consequence of the Arabian processes of adaptation to the socio-ecological crisis of the 6th century in the context of the developing autochthonous Arabian traditions of prophecy and monotheism. That is, his adaptation was not the cause of the emergence of Islam, but rather created in many areas of the Arabian Peninsula a socio-political environment more suitable for the development of an autochthonous Arabian monotheistic religion. At the same time, the spiritual prerequisites for its occurrence appeared apparently already existed at the time the crisis began. And the last slide, actually, as I worked together with scientists, together we managed to reconstruct a sort of perhaps one of the longest causal chain of events. So this event starts with decline of solar activity, which results in the growth of the Earth's ice caps, which results in the change of the form of the planet Earth, which results in readjustments of the Earth's crust to the new form of the planet, which results in the rise of tectonic activity, which results in volcano eruptions, which results in injection of aerosols in the atmosphere, which results in the decrease of the amount of the solar radiation reaching the Earth's surface, which results in further cooling of the atmosphere, which results in the droughts, which results in the destruction of the Arab kingdoms or chiefdoms, which results in the formation of anti-royal tribal ethos, which results in discreditation of terrestrial political powers, which results in formation of political anthropological context most favorable for the development of an Arabian autochthonous monotheist religion, which results in the formation of Islam. But there are also three other causal changes working together which have not been spelled out. Perhaps I will stop at this point. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. Okay. Next one to present is Daniel Pinho Barreiros from Federal University of Rio de Janeiro with the presentation of Pandemic Complexity and the World System, a study of Antonine Plague, 165, 108C.
So thank you very much. I'd like to just address first what's the perspective on this panel. We are trying to figure out how world systems would appear if we take into consideration not only the social sciences, but also the natural sciences. That's the idea of some kind of big history of the world systems. It's not new. In fact, even Wallerstein pointed out in this direction, but we're trying to, take it this further, So that's the whole idea of our presentations, or most of our presentations. I'll address some topics that Andrey has already talked about, but my context is a little bit different. I'll be talking about the second century of the Common Era, and I'll try to discuss the relationship between social complexity, pandemics, and the world systems. Fabio? We're used to accept that world systems are a modern phenomenon, but world systems are not a modern phenomenon. The first recognized world system dates back to the second century in the Common Era. Of course, was a very different world system compared to the capitalist world system. But anyway, you had at that time different civilizations, different cultures connected by trade routes and with a very active and vibrant cultural exchange that connected the major cities in China to the northern cities in India and in the Levant and the Roman Empire. And as a rule, you can accept that when you have trade connections and cultural connections, you probably have pathogenic connections. These things they go together. This is a stylized map of the Roman Empire in its highest and in its peak of expansion. It's just for illustration. Go ahead. So this is the chronic of the most important events in the Roman Empire during the period I will be talking about. In 165, there was a disease identified in Smyrna, 2 cities in the Levant. There are many evidence of a strange disease taking these 2 cities. 1 year after that, an army returns from Persia after a war against the Parthians, and this army, this Roman army, brought with it a disease, the same disease that was getting Nisbis in Smyrna. 2 years after that, there was many losses due to death or flight in the cities of the Delta, the Egyptian Delta. Yeah? And after that, the disease takes Rome, etc., and you go to the end of the century, yeah? And we have the funerary stela in Lydia, in the Asia Minor, also revealing a large peak of mortality. Of course, this is piecemeal evidence. This is not, this is not a historical series you can really trust. But definitely there was something going on in the Roman Empire. And not only in the Roman Empire, there was something going on all along the way to China. And what was happening was a very strange pandemics. Go ahead. We don't know what kind of disease was that. Most of the scholars think that there was some kind of some strain of the pox virus, which means there was some strain of smallpox, and the virus that exists today is not the same that existed in the 2nd century, but it was some kind of smallpox. Duncan Jones estimated that between 35 and 30% of the urban population, all along the way from the Roman Empire to China, suffered losses. He can't say that they died, but the disease affected at least 30% of the urban population, at least. Elio Locascio, that's an Italian historian, estimated 20% in 20 years, and different historians they deal with different evidence pointing to the fact that there was a major outbreak of something destroying the Roman Empire. Don't leave me alone. That's it. Yes. Why? How do you know that this was a systemic process? Because if you get together, if you look to different productions in historiography dealing with different regions of the world, you get the same. During the same time, there was something happening from the Rhine to China, or to Persia for certain, and China probably. There were a major outbreak of something in China as well. Go ahead. Okay. The thesis is this growing world system that was being built since the mid-2nd century, it came to a halt in the end of the century. We have many evidence that it was happening. First, this is the first major evidence. In the Nile Delta, in the northern Egypt, we have no evidence that large plots of land were being leased during these 2 decades, during the peak of the disease. Why that? It was very common that large plots of land were leased for a short time, which meant that there was, before the pandemic, there was something like a major demand for land. Probably because of the disease, the demand for land fell, and we have between in this period smaller plots of land being leased for a longer time, which means that the situations of the people who are trying to rent this land was increased because there are less people fighting over the same land. Right. You have the retraction of the number of taxpayers in the Nile, and there are many deaths recorded. There are many losses recorded. You can know that if the disappearance of people meant that they died or that they fled. We don't know. Yeah. But the fact is, in Caranhas, for example, in the Fayum is a region in the west of the west bank of the Nile. You register 33 to 47 fewer taxpayers during this period. Why these people were not paying their taxes? There's no explanation. Yeah. In the Fayum, there are other registers of people dying, etc., etc. The question is, people were fleeing or dying. whatever, it makes no difference, because if they were dying, okay, we know that the pandemic was actually happening. If they were fleeing from what? They were fleeing from villages. They were some kind of crowded villages. They were probably trying to escape from something. And you know that social isolation is the major mean of avoiding contagion in the ancient world. In the modern world, some people try to, discredit the idea that social isolation was important against the pandemics, but in the ancient world, it was normal. If there was some kind of disease getting someplace, people would flee. Right. We have, for example, the records of non-irrigated land in the Nile during these 2 years. It's very impressive, because there was a register of many tracts of land not being irrigated. We don't know why, but we have an idea. There are some palynological and geochronological evidence that there was a shortage of water, drought, for example, in the Nile. So this was how you have less land being irrigated. Or consider that the major supplier of wheat to the Roman Empire was Egypt at that time, which means that if you had less land being irrigated, less production of wheat, you have also some food problems, which would aggravate the immunological conditions of Roman people, especially in the big cities. So it's probable that some hydrological problem and climatic problem before the pandemic paved the way for the spread of the disease. Go ahead. Okay. This is the best one. This is beyond doubt. It's highly proved that you had some kind of disruption of territorial integration in communications all along the way to China. How do you know that? Because during the reign of Trajan, for example, before the pandemic happens, for example, when Trajan was crowned, you find documents being signed by the former, by Hadrian, by the former emperor, 15 days after the coronation of the emperor, which means that the information took 15 days to reach the most external regions of the empire. During the pandemics, for example, after Marcus Aurelius died and Commodus was crowned, 46 days after Marcus Aurelius died and Commodus was crowned, there were documents being signed by Marcus Aurelius. So that it means that 46 days after the death of an emperor, the information didn't get the closest cities from Rome. So there was really a problem in communication. And if information wasn't circulating, goods wouldn't either. These things goes together. Okay, go ahead. There's a very clear evidence of inequalities growing during the pandemics. The slaves suffered a lot. I'll go fast through that. The conditions of the slaves, they were not slaves like in the capitalist America, for example, but the conditions of these slaves were very harsh. They suffered a lot with that pandemic. Go ahead. Another evidence that something was going on is that the mining activity between 164 and 190 collapsed. We have this clear evidence that the mining activity was dropping very fast. There's a time gap in the mining data from the 160s onwards. And for example, the quarries, the marble quarries, we have no evidence of marble quarreling during the period. Why that? Why they just simply stop to quarrel, to extract marble from the quarries? We don't know that. We don't know that. Probably because of the pandemics. We have evidence that after the pandemics, in the beginning of the 30th century, there was a destruction of monuments all over the Roman Empire to reuse the marble for construction. Why they were reusing marble? It was because marble wasn't being produced, because there was no one in the quarries to extract marble. Go ahead. There's another great evidence that there's something was going on there. There's a major reduction in lead pollution in Greenland ice cores. And what's the relation between the pandemics and lead pollution? That's one. We know that silver is extracted. When you extract silver, silver is mixed with lead ore. There are major veins of lead. And silver is in between there. You have to extract the lead. You have to toss away all this metal you don't want and keep the silver you need. And the reduction in pollution levels meant that there was no extraction of silver. If there was no extraction of silver, it meant that the demand for silver dropped. And dropped why? Because the trade and the commercial activities were also dropping, Go ahead. And the most important, there is a clear evidence that the activities on the Silk Road were affected by this process. How do I know that? How do we know that? But the major destination of the trade caravans coming from China and India was Palmyra. Palmyra was a city in the mainland Syria, in the middle of the territory of the contemporary Syria. And Palmyra was a Roman city by all standards. It was a big city with a big commercial and merchant class, a very rich city. That was some kind of gateway to enter the Roman Empire if you have a caravan coming from the east, And it's clear that until by 160, you have a lot of evidence of funerary monuments in Palmyra, very rich funerary monuments for this merchant class. During the pandemic, something new appears. There's some contracts appeared on the documentation showing that people were sharing tombs. The merchants were sharing tombs. They were leasing their tombs to other people. Why they were doing that? Because they were becoming poorer, of course. Because the Silk Road was losing their traction, losing their activity. You know why that? Because in China there was an outbreak of a disease as well. And this disease was carried all over the Silk Road, as happened in the Black Plague. That's the same route, the same route, The disease emerged in the major urban cities in China and was spread all over this systemic connection. And just to end, just my last slide, what's the last evidence we have that something was going on there, systemically speaking? It's deforestation, There's like extreme collapse in deforestation in the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s. And it goes into the extraction of timber only only grows again in the following century. What it means? It means that if you're extracting less timber, you are having less urban construction, less naval construction, and all of these are proxies to, we would say modernly, economic growth, And so, as I said, it's all piecemeal evidence. You don't have a silver bullet to say, oh, there was a systemic crisis there, But if you join together geological, climatic, social, economic, epidemiological evidence. And if you can get a real chronology of all these facts, because all of this is history, and put that together, they gives you a hint that something really systemic, really big was going on in Eurasia in the 2nd century. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The next one is Daniel Ribera Vainfas from Federal University of Rio de Janeiro too, with the work Climate in 14th Century England, Catastrophic Change, Social Strategy, and Origin of Capitalism.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you for having me here. I'm Daniel. I'm also from Federal University of Rio. And today I want to talk to you about climate change in 14th century England. It's a subject of my PhD thesis, and it's a snippet of the research I did. So please. The hypothesis here is that the transition from feudalism to capitalism was conditioned by climate change. It was not determined by it, but it was a condition for it to happen. The goal here is to highlight the relations between the macro phenomena of the time, pandemic and climate change mostly, and to relate it to the short duration events, mostly the change in the class systems in England and the social changes that led to the emergence of capitalism. Specifically, the Black Death and the North Sea Basin climate change events. Also the change in agriculture and the transformations of property structures that correlate with those macro changes we're talking about. And a theme to keep in mind here, something Professor Chase Dunn said yesterday, changes comes from the periphery of the system. We often tend to think about the periphery in the context of world systems as national states. We talk about countries, we talk about people, but the unity of analysis can be different as well. We can talk about class systems like we had in England in the 14th century. We can talk about regional peripheries. We have many degrees for which to look at. The lenses can vary, but this relative importance of the periphery creeps up. Please. For here, I'd like to go further. Those are all hashed out, but here, yes. This is a simplified scheme to talk about the transition debates. The transition debate is very famous in the Marxist literature. It's nearly 100 years old. It's a seminal debate on the topic. And we had three big authors, Sweezy, Dobb, and Brenner, each one bringing a contribution to the transition debate. Sweezy talks about the foreign trade as the catalyst of change. Dobb talks about overexploitation of the peasant class. Brenner talks about the class struggle as the engine of change. All those perspectives have their merits, and it's not my place here to say, well, this one's right and all the others are rubbish. But what I want us to take a look here is that we can improve on this debate if we take a modern stance on it. If we take a look at them and say, well, 100 years ago, they didn't know about climate change the way we do now. So what happens if we put that climate change as a problem for them to talk to us about? And that's the idea here. Next slide, please. Sweezy has a very interesting idea in which he postulates that change comes from the outside to have an external factor that drives it up. He talks about foreign trade. I don't think that's quite proper. I would like to propose that climate change is a catalyst of the process we have here, in the sense that Sweezy proposed that foreign trade was the catalyst of the downfall of feudalism. Also, this climate changes helps us to understand what both Brenner and Dobb were talking about, because it amplifies the process. please. Yes. So what are the macro phenomena we have to deal here? First of all, we have changes on the demographic level as a result of the Black Death. That creates both vacant land plots and the simultaneous appropriation of those by lords and peasants alike, of course, in different manners, in different structures. But we have a change in the structure of the land property in England because the Black Death left huge sources of land without people. Also, and that is very important, we have a change in the rain-in pattern. Changes in rain-in patterns can be absolutely catastrophic for societies because they increase exponentially the level of uncertainty they have to deal with. As an agriculture, as a peasant, if you don't know when it's going to rain, you cannot produce, you cannot prepare for any crop failures that tend to increase. So we have, at this time, an increase in North Sea storminess, which is a very, very interesting problem from the point of extreme climatic events, because it's not that it's raining less or more, it's just raining differently. It's raining in a more intense pattern. The rains are less evenly distributed, they are more concentrated in big storms. And that matches with a very interesting trait of the North Sea Basin. Because if you take a look here, the North Sea Basin is mostly wetlands. They are what they call in England the fenlands, they're marshes, they are what we call here in Brazil manguezais. They're basically that. And the occupation of said land is always linked with floods and storms. There's no people there that doesn't know that, well, sometimes the sea rises and takes us our home. This area here, I'm not sure if you can properly see, but all this area here, both the coast of Holland on the north of Netherlands and the east coast of England, they are particularly vulnerable to those rain-in patterns change, because that's where the storms hit. The storms come from the North Atlantic, they come here in the North Sea, and they hit all those coasts. And by hitting them, they increase the sea level, they destroy crops, they cause crop failures, they ruin cities. You have many historical documents telling that whole cities were eaten up by the sea at that time because of the increased storminess, please. As a result, some crops, they become impossible to grow. Grains, especially wheat, which is the base of European diet, they are very sensitive to those rainfall pattern changes. And as a result, we see a change in the specialization of production in that area because, well, people tend to specialize in what they can produce. If you're living on a marshland and it's suddenly impossible to grow wheat, you're not going to specialize in growing wheat. You're going to specialize in what you can grow, and that, in the English case, was a change from wheat to sheep production. Of course, it's not about creating a new way of production from scratch. It's not about getting somewhere that was nothing and then boom, you have something. Those are the same people. They generationally change their ways of production. The same peasant families that planted wheat and raised sheep, they begin to, well, grow less wheat and raise more sheep. Until then, they only have sheep and no more wheat. After the 14th century, that relative weight between sheep and wheat changes. Sheep is a fantastic solution in the climate change circumstance because it's easier to adapt to those extreme climate events. Transhumance, that is the migration of sheep from a wetland to a dry land in certain periods, they are a short-term answer because, well, a sheep has legs. You can convince it to go somewhere else. Wheat does not. You can, no matter how much you talk to your wheat crop, you're never going to convince it to move upwards. A sheep, you may have some success. Wetlands also keep their fertility as feeding grounds. They're not suited They're not suitable for planting wheat, but they have some sort of weed that the sheep can eat. And by that, you can turn that into an economic profitable way of production. Also, there's international demand of the product wool because of the international trade circuit of the Baltic. So those peasants there, they can sell their wool in order to buy wheat from some other source. Now, this leads to an incremental consolidation of specialization that pattern radiates from England's east coast towards its interior. And at a point you get, well, the least likely soil to get wet becomes a soil for cultivating wheat, and the ones that are most at risk of getting inundated, getting flooded, become the soil for raising sheep. Now, this by itself is not capitalism. You have specialization in many circumstances. It's as old as humanity. But if you want to take a look and find, well, where is capitalism here? We need to take a look at the social structure. And that's about two major changes: the transformation of the peasant nobility at a time and the transformation of the rich peasants at a time. This is a simplified schema about the social classes in medieval England. Most often we take a look and say, well, the nobles and the peasants, that's the division of England's society, and that is true to some extent. But even those classes have their specifics inside of them, because the nobles itself, they were divided in magnates and the pet nobles, which were very distinct in each other. A magnate could never be a knight of the Shire or whatever. The sheriff of Nottingham is here, but the King John is here, and Robin Hood is here. They're all in this segment here, and they are very distinct from each other. Also, the peasants, they have the free peasant, the liberali, and you have the serfs, you have the slaves of that society. They are not the same. A free peasant had rights. They could plead to the king. A serf could never. It was a slave, a side to the earth. It was pretty much nothing. And they also change in time, because those free peasants here, all Middle Ages, they could rise to some sort of administrative duties, like the bailiffs, and they themselves could eventually own lands in the form of yeomen. Those people, those families, they were changing. The petty nobles became the knights during the 13th century, which are then concentrated in some later 15th century knights, which were very much different than that person here, and also created new sorts of gentry, new sorts of class structures. There were new figures in the social landscape of England. This is very nuanced. It must be, because when we take a look at England, there's no such a thing as England. England's not a reality like I'm a reality, like you are a reality. Nation states, countries, they are an abstract unit of reasoning we apply to a problem. And here I'm proposing, well, let's take a look at the class systems as another fictional unit of analysis, because it will reveal us more details about the fragmentation of that society and the interests they have in the changes that are happening. So please, what is happening here? Well, the knights in the 13th century, they went through a concentration process. If you begin the 13th century with like 10,000 knights, you end the 13th century with 3,000 knights. There's a sharp decline in the number of knights in England. That is a suggestion, every author talks about that, of a concentration of power in those knights that are left. They have more power in the realm, they have more land, they have more transit with the king, but they also have less administrative duties. They delegate those duties to non-knights, which have kinship ties to nobilities, but are not themselves nobles yet. Those are the squires and gentlemen. They're landlords, they're not nobles, there's something in between. They are in the process of becoming nobles. So also you have changes among the rich peasants, because every peasant shows a degree of differentiation throughout the Middle Ages. For example, the bailiffs, the administratives of the villas. With the crisis after the Black Death, those richer peasants, the yeomen, they incorporate empty lands, which intensifies the intra-peasant differentiation. Now, please, thank you. Those new social characters, gentlemen and yeomen mostly, they differ significantly from the typical Middle Ages, because their status is not based on custom. They need to access the market in order to reclaim a share of the economic surplus, and they must use that economic surplus to maintain and increase their own status. Those are actors that need the market, and they pop up when the social fabric is weakening. Now, what is most important here is they're growing. They're growing at a fast pace here. Of course, some sort of them always existed. There was always a rich peasant with some land and a petty noble with transit among the nobility, but they were never this big, were never this important, mostly because the conditions created by the climate change created a niche in which they could evolve and turn into something new. That was mostly the wool production that allowed them to extract rent from non-productive land sites, and also the incorporation of the empty lands left behind after the Black Death that helped them to expand. Now, those actors, as Brenner said, they act under the shell of feudalism, and they change the property structure on their favor, mostly through enclosures, because they help them increase the extraction, but also because enclosures become possible after the macro changes, mostly empty lands, and the traditional techniques are no longer suited to exploit the wetlands. So to wrap it up, the macro phenomenon of that time creates a series of conditions that help shape social change. At the same time, England has its own development trajectory that is happening at the time. The concentration of the knighthood class and the differentiation of the peasants. Those happen to be the crossroads from which capitalism emerged. It's a connection between the autochthonous change from England's society and the climate change that's happening. And from that collision, something new shows up. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Next one is Robert Ortiz from California State University. Okay. And with presentation of the paper, The Rise and the Ongoing Demise of Fossil Fuel Development, Late Capitalism and State Socialism in a World Ecological Perspective.
So anyways, with that said, I will start with stating the obvious, of course, petroleum, which is the focus of my talk. I would say fossil fuels in general, but I will focus on oil, because it has been the dominant energy input in capitalism, at least since the 1940s. Depending on your timeline, you might push it back, but at least since the 1940s has been the central energy input in the world systems. This centrality, of course, embodies multiple contradictions, tensions that require unpacking. Because of time, I will not have time to go over all of those. In the longer paper version of this talk, I cover much more ground. So my focus here will be mostly to do a very brief and broad mapping of the trajectory of oil field development in the US, the Soviet Union, but most importantly in Cuba and Puerto Rico, which are two showcases of the Cold War era. Cuba being a showcase for the Soviet system, Puerto Rico being a showcase for the capitalist American system. So I will focus on them two mostly. I will describe their paths very quickly and speculate on what these cases can tell us about what's coming in the future in the context of climate change and global warming. With that said, to start, oil production as a large-scale enterprise has emerged in many places. Just to acknowledge, like indigenous people in the Caribbean and in what is today Venezuela and Mexico knew about oil. They call it different names. In Venezuela, for example, they call it mene. So, but as a large-scale commercial enterprise, I would say that its emergence is mainly in the U.S. and the Russian Empire, sometime in the late 19th century. And from there, the frontier of oil production spread relatively quickly. So I give you there in this like a general sense outside of the U.S. First Mexico, Russia, then USSR, Venezuela. Then by the 1930s, 40s, mostly Venezuela keeps a significant lead, but then you have Saudi Arabia, other Gulf oil states, etc. The early industry, especially in the case of the U.S., which was probably the most important, was always marked by boom and bust cycles, turbulent like price volatility, intense labor unrest, and the industry as we know it today transitioned from that to a more regular regime between the 1930s and the rise of U.S. hegemony in the post-war era. So there's many overlapping moments that lead to this kind of stable, quote-unquote, energy system. I would say institutions that regulate and coordinate supply that first emerged in places like Texas, then at the federal state, then we have the OPEC institution. The mechanization of agriculture, the concomitant rise of the petrochemical industry, and most important of all, of course, the most obvious thing, which is the transformation of global landscapes with the spread of like car use and just transportation driven by internal combustion engines. All of this, especially in the North, created what I call a link between accumulation dynamics and relatively low oil prices. So the graph that I have there, I'm not going to go into details, but it just shows, this comes from my other research, the negative statistical relationship that exists between oil price changes and profit rates, mainly across the North. So to put it like simply, cheap oil, reasonably low oil prices maintain high profit rates in the global North. It's not the only factor, but it's the central factor. Whenever oil prices have been significantly high, they have corresponded with crunches in the profitability of the capitalist economies and in prices. In addition to that, oil fuel accumulation in the North, IR has pacified workers in a sense, has taken away a lot of the intensity of the labor struggles. And ultimately, in addition to all that, we know that oil field accumulation is full of socio-ecological crises and disasters. The picture I have in the slide is from an oil spill that happened 2 years ago in Huntington Beach, California, which is close to where I live. I went there to pictures of the disaster, which has become now like a almost an everyday occurrence. So people are a little bit, I would say, used to it. So it's not seen as a big deal, but as you can see, it's a problem that goes beyond climate change. So that's global North oil accumulation, where oil has been more an input to capitalist dynamics. Interestingly, counterpoint to that will be the history of oil in Russia, where the main logic has not been that of oil as an input for accumulation, but I would say oil exports as a way of financing what the Soviets ultimately perfected, which some scholars would call anti-systemic developmentalism. First, something that is revolutionary in aspiration, but very practical in the goals that are trying to achieve, improving health standards, education, etc., with whatever means necessary. So the interesting thing here is that at least in the beginnings of the oil industry in Russia, oil workers were very central. Just, workers in the US, in the oil industry in the US, were very militant in the early years. But in the Russian case and in the Mexican case that I will talk about now, they were way more radical. They pushed They were in part protagonists in those two great revolutions of the early 20th century, the Mexican and the Russian Revolution. I actually have, there's an article by Suni, an expert on Russian history, who basically describes how Stalin saw his, and we know what Stalin became later, but for now, let's put that in brackets, how Stalin saw his work in the Baku oil fields of the Russian Empire as he called it his baptism in revolution. And those workers in the Baku oil fields of the Russian Empire, today Azerbaijan, were protagonists in the 1905 revolution that Lenin himself described as this dress rehearsal from the 1917 revolution. Long story short, the nationalization of the oil industry was pushed forward by Soviet workers themselves, and the Soviet government just rubber-stamped what was happening in the fields. That kind of like anti-systemic revolutionary upheaval was quickly transformed into a more practical, let's just produce oil to export. So I would say that my argument in the article is that the transformation of the Soviet Union to basically an oil energy exporter to, let's call it the capitalist West, combined with the Soviet Union's own adoption of 4D norms of consumption production, the Soviet car became a symbol of their developmentalist project, took away that early revolutionary impetus and transformed the Soviet Union into a semi-peripheral oil exporting state that ultimately, we know all the inefficiencies of their system, but I would say ultimately what emerged first as a challenger to core capitalism, in my view, became what I would call a quasi-world empire, what Wallerstein would call a world empire, that was incorporated into the capitalist system, and it just, since then on, Russia today is basically an oil exporter, depends a lot on energy prices. I wouldn't go as far as, I remember the guy who ran for president in 2008 from the Republicans, McCain, who said that Russia was like a gas station with nuclear arms. That's an exaggeration, it's way more than that, but I get his point. So with that said, this has been like a general mapping of global north, anti-systemic developmentalism. Most of my focus in the paper is actually what happened in the showcases, in the semi-peripheries or peripheries of those states. And here we'll focus mainly on Cuba and Puerto Rico, which I show here in the map. These are oil-fired power plants, the dots, just in case. Puerto Rico has a significant number of them. 80% of the energy in the island is produced energy in terms of electricity from oil. And if you add coal, it's like 98% of the energy. Cuba is more or less in the same range, pretty high level of use of oil for electricity generation, and we will see how that has impacted their strategy. So let's start with Puerto Rico. So Puerto Rico's like transition to fossil fuel development was cemented under colonial U.S. power. I don't have time to go over the history of Puerto Rico, but it was first for centuries a colonial possession of Spain. And then in 1898 was invaded by the U.S. as part of the Spanish-American War and became very quickly part of the U.S. empire. While it already has some oil refinery, I would call that a refinery, some very rudimentary power plants, basically generators used by landlords. It was under U.S. power that Puerto Rico became like a fossil fuel developmental project. So by the 1950s, you see the building of massive thermoelectric plants like the one that I have the picture in the bottom, which is actually my hometown of Salinas, Puerto Rico. That plant has two massive boilers. This is like 19th century almost thing. They burn oil in those two massive plant generators and produce electricity for 20% of the island. So when those two collapse, 20% of the island is without electricity. So and that's one of the power plants that we have. So most of them work in the same way. So they're basically oil-fired thermoelectric power plants. Combining that with manufacturing, with tax breaks for American capital, Puerto Rico actually became a model that's very rarely is emphasized. This graph here is almost difficult to see. The first green line here is Puerto Rico's GDP per capita as a share of world GDP per capita. The important thing to highlight here is that Puerto Rico's takeoff in terms of income relative to most of the world, especially the global south, was happened a few decades before than the so-called tigers of East Asia, in Singapore, Hong Kong, South Korea, and Puerto Rico's per capita income by the 1950s, 60s, and 70s was higher than probably almost any other place in the third world. Of course, fossil fuel, cheap labor, environmental disasters, all that kind of stuff happening. So it became a model that was exhausted very quickly. By the 1980s, we see declining manufacturing employment. This is what this graph shows. Since then, we have had rising inequality, rising unemployment, and most tragic of separation of families because people had to move outside of the island. One factor in the story has been the recurring impacts by hurricanes that happens. I put that joke there and I forgot to take it out. As the Puerto Rican governor from a few years ago who looks a lot like Michael Scott from The Office. But anyways, that's the humor to like The Office. So anyways, so we have been impacted by hurricanes constantly. And in 2017, the big one, I think, hit Hurricane Maria, a disaster, blackouts that lasted for months. This is just actually just a regular road in the capital of the island. So people were using boats to move around. Thousands of people die. If you scale in terms of population, will be millions of people in another context. And interestingly, it was like a turning point that led a lot of people to the realization that what the model we had, fossil fuel, light manufacturing model doesn't work, that we need something else. But that's not how the crisis was managed at the beginning. The governor here, who I show in this picture, actually used the crisis originally to push for the privatization of the energy system. He said, actually, this system is giving us blackouts, not because it's oil fuel, it's because it's run by the state. And the state doesn't do anything good. It's inefficient, it's low, it's wasteful. So let's privatize it. Clear cut, shock doctrine, Naomi Klein kind of stuff, right? But interestingly, in this case, it didn't work. There was a scandal that he was using a private chat to basically joke about the deaths of Puerto Ricans, to not take the crisis seriously. And for the first time in the island history, somebody in power had to resign because the pressure from mass mobilization was so huge that I myself was surprised. So I would never, thank you. I wasn't there because, yeah, it's one of the first cases. And again, it's like, when I say the first time, I'm including the colonial era. So there's like centuries of government. Yeah, exactly. So he had to renounce, and I see since 2020, a lot of people in the US have been hyper-focused on elections here, but they don't see that in Puerto Rico there has been a massive shift. At the bottom, people moving to agroecology. At the top, more left-leaning candidates winning. Let's see how this goes, but I would say it's just one projection of what might happen in the future, meaning a massive ecological disaster that triggers social political transformation. I will stop the case of Puerto Rico here just to give a minute or two on Cuba, because I was saying the case of Puerto Rico we're talking about mainly about potential. So what about Cuba? In Cuba is a parallel here. As Puerto Rico, it's like a fossil fuel developmental state for decades, not because of colonial relations, but more because of his alliance with the USSR under that system of sugar from Cuba, oil from the US. Cuba developed one of the most mechanized production systems meaning agricultural systems in the Americas, in per capita basis, probably using more oil and chemicals than even the US. In the 1980s, of course, it was financing significant achievements that are almost cliche to mention today, but we should be reminded of, high life expectancy, low infant mortality, more doctors per capita than the US, Mexico, Brazil, whatever country you can imagine. So it was an impressive developmental record, but it was not ecologically sustainable by any chance. And it was not financially sustainable either, because it was mostly dependent on basically cheap subsidies of oil from the Soviet Union. When 1990 came and the collapse of the Soviet Union happened, this was a disaster for Cuba. So in a way, I see it as a parallel to the hurricane in Puerto Rico. It was not a hurricane per se, but it was almost like a hurricane. Well, in a way, it was worse. Imports declined by 70%. Cuba's capacity to recover was limited by US sanctions, so the Clinton administration used very cynically that moment to push for democracy. And interestingly, in the history of the revolution, that's one of the few moments that you see mass uprising The 1994 Mariconazo, the video that I have there, the link for, shows Fidel Castro had to actually go there and address the people in person because people were, of course, tired and angry, meaning food shortages, energy shortages. So Fidel and the leadership declared this moment a special period in the times of peace. So it's like the idea that we have to mobilize as if it is a war. And what that meant was a contradictory strategy, I have to say. One thing they did was to increase oil extraction in Cuba, which today is actually, of course, contradictory, but impressive because they actually produce half of the energy they use from their own oil fields, which is something that before 1990 was not even considered. On the more positive side, they started experimenting with agroecology, low import agriculture, urban farming, and that's something you see in Havana is full of urban gardens. People are growing their food. By the 2000s, farmers in Cuba were producing almost 70% of some of the basic staples. In general, the net outcome has been a decline in CO2 emissions. So this the trajectory of CO2 emissions, they collapsed in 1990 and they never went back to that level. Important gains in the sense of how the country was able to manage the crisis, feed people, and let's say defend some of the achievements of the past revolution. Unfortunately, I have to say that most of it has been undermined by the recent crisis. The combination of Trump's new sanctions that Biden never removed, plus the pandemic, had decimated the Cuban economy. So you just have rising prices, shortages of energy. I still see people's capacity to manage. It's just increasingly more difficult, but it makes you think what will be possible. And that's the thing that I will, my last thing will be, what will be possible if the blockade didn't exist, right? So why? Because my argument is that Cuba is not working at full capacity. It has that massive blockade that prevents a lot of stuff from happening. And in the US, the common sense idea is like communism doesn't work. Like if you're so convinced that it doesn't work, leave the embargo. Let it fail on its own. I think there's a little bit of foreign policy establishment in the US that they think it might work, so we cannot leave the embargo. So that's where we stand. That said, I ran this very simple counterfactual of how global emissions will be if we use different countries as the standard. The black line at the top is how global emissions will be if the US was the global standard, meaning if everybody in the world had emissions per capita as the US. As you can see, impossible. We would be like burning alive already. Cuba is the only country that will lower actually global emissions and has maintained somewhat reasonable with a lot of problems developmental record. I will leave it for there in the sense that it shows, just like Puerto Rico shows one potential, it shows another. And with that said, I thank you for listening to me. I will stop for now and hopefully we can have a conversation. Thank you.
So they're gonna present.
Thank you. The next one is with Fred Speer from University of Amsterdam, Holland, with the work How Did Humanity Get Itself into its Current Ecological Predicament?
Muito obrigado a todos y todas. Y, por invitarme, for inviting me, especially at Daniel Pinho Barreiros. I'm sure I'm not pronouncing all of this very well, but my Portuguese is very limited, so I'll have to continue in English. But I do realize that, yes, I'm now part of a panel that is pretty far away on the other side of the Atlantic in southern Brazil, where I'm sitting here in cold and windy Amsterdam. Anyway, so my question is a little bigger than that of the very interesting presentations of my predecessors. I'm trying to answer the question, how did humanity get itself into its current ecological predicament? And to get an idea of what that means for me is, well, I brought here an apple, and let's assume that the apple is the earth, right? The earth that we all live on. Now, if that is the earth, then the skin of this apple is thinner than the layer on top of the earth, the biosphere, that we all live in. That's not a lot, right? If I start peeling that skin, I'm peeling away the entire biosphere, which is the only area in the universe as we know it that is suitable for life as we know it. So if you look at it from this perspective, it's pretty urgent to understand what the biosphere is, how it works, what its history is, and what we humans have been doing to it, because we may be on a course to wreck it, at least in a sense for keeping it suitable for human life in the far future in reasonable well-being. So that is the focus of my 14 or 13 minutes left that I have. I will now start my PowerPoint presentation, and let me see whether I can get that done quickly. Usually it works very well. I hope it works now. Yep. And I'll try to. Can you see it full screen now? Is that working? Like this?
Yes.
Yeah,
we
that's
see.
that's what I want. So I've been thinking and researching this question for the past 40, 50 years now. And for the past 30 years, I've been involved in what has become known as big history, the history of the entire universe, from the beginning of the universe until life on Earth today. And what I'm going to say now about the Earth, this apple, is just the apple is a tiny fraction of that history, obviously. But as part of trying to understand big history, I started using a kind of theory that sprang forward from sociological theory that I had used earlier to analyze the history of Peru, which was a 10 to 15 year project that came before big history. Anyway, that theory was in terms of regimes, and it was elaborated in several books that I'm not going to explain now, but it's important to keep in mind that there is a theory behind it, and a theory helps to structure the understanding of all of that history. Much like the theory of, let's say, the theory of the chemical bond and the structure of the atoms and chemical elements helps to structure all of chemistry. You don't need to know all the individual reactions, but it is important to understand the general structure and the general theory. And I think the same holds true for big history. But while doing that, I still realized that we didn't have a theory, pretty good theory yet about the history of the biosphere. And it turned out that I happened to stumble into that now 7 years ago while researching, not really researching, actually growing pepper plants for fun, and then discovering patterns that helped me to understand the history of the biosphere. And that resulted in this book. It's called How the Biosphere Works. Fresh views discovered while growing peppers. And it's not just a picture, it's a real book. You can see it here. That's important to understand in these days where with AI you can generate almost anything, but it's a real book. It was published 2 years ago. And I'll explain only the most central elements of the theory. And what happened? Well, here you see my pepper plants. This was in August of 2017. And what you see, they're producing really a lot of leaves. And I was wondering at a certain point for how would the surface of all these leaves combined, just the total surface of all these leaves, how would it relate to the surface of the pot they were sitting in, its surface? And you can see immediately when you see that, yes, you see that must be a lot more. So I measured that roughly, turned out to be a factor of 20. So and that meant that they jointly were maximizing the capture of solar energy, because they're getting a lot more solar energy in this way than solar energy that fell on the surface of the flower pot, right? And in September, a month later roughly, they had made even more of those layers. So we're really jointly trying to summarize, to maximize the capture of solar energy. And I realized not only pepper plants are doing that, but if you leave, let's say, nature undisturbed by human action, that is what nature does. So just look at the Amazon region. I don't need to tell you that in Brazil, I guess. But here you see that principle in action. You see that it's as green as it could get, and even the rivers, at least those parts that are stagnant, where the green stuff is not washed away, then you see that it's completely green, and that is the result of the competition for solar energy, and as a result, the joint tendency towards maximizing its capture. That hadn't been noticed yet, strangely, as far as I know. But it seems to be a central point. So what happens when humans start doing that? There are things, this is a picture from Spain, from Asturias, the Via of Salas. Then you can see when people start doing agriculture, there is no longer this tendency of nature to jointly strive towards maximizing the capture of solar energy because humans are interfering. They're trying to channel that solar energy or the results of the solar energy as captured by nature in the form of plants and animals towards themselves. They're constructing their own things and all of that. So there you can see a very stark difference between the period before human action, so to speak, and the period we live in, that is the period of human action. Now, a major point I think I will make is that for any organism to survive, capturing energy is a very important portion of your survival strategy, of your survival regime. Without it, you can forget it, right? Nobody's going to survive. No single organism is going to make it. And also you can see that's, for example, those petal plants, the structure that they have is very much determined to a considerable extent by the need to capture that energy. That's why they look the way they do. And just think of humans. Well, how do we capture energy? Well, we have eyes and nose and ear, and it's all very close to our food intake area, so to speak. So make sure that we get the food and we get it into our mouth, right? And our arms and hands are helping us to do that. And that is the case for all organisms. So considerable portion of the structure of any organism is determined by the need to capture enough energy to survive. Now, the tendency to jointly strive towards maximizing the capture of the available energy, I call that the fourth law of thermodynamics. It's a little too far, I guess, now to explain what the laws of thermodynamics are, but it is, I think, in addition to the established three ones, and the first one is the conservation of energy. Energy doesn't get lost, but it can get degraded, so to speak, and that is what's called entropy in that language, and it's entropy strives towards a maximum. And the third law basically says that in the sense that the history of the universe will strive toward a certain value, that everything will become basically messy, chaotic. That's the end result of the universe if we think this is correct. So this is an addition that when you get a planet with a biosphere where life emerges, then a different process kicks in, this tendency toward maximizing the capture of the available energy. And that may be another law of thermodynamics. And as part of that, as we all know, we don't have only plants that capture energy, but also animals emerge that eat those plants, and animals that eat other animals, etc. But it's all sustained by mostly sunlight, but also by geological energy to some extent. And also you have to wonder what's the place of microorganisms. But what you can see is that during the history of the biosphere, you get what I would now call a food capturing pyramid that tends to change all the time, and all these different organisms exercise influences on the biosphere. It's far beyond my possibility to even start pointing that out, but let's just keep it the way it is. So if you think about the history of the biosphere, then you think about the beginning of life and then this emerging of this food capturing pyramid over time, all of these organisms with different effects on the biosphere, transforming it into something that is very different from what it would have been without life. And at a certain point, very, very recent in the biosphere's history, we get humans. And what humans are doing? And I think you can argue very well that humans are suddenly popping out of this food capturing pyramid and then start jointly striving towards maximizing the capture of the available free energy to use them for their own purposes, right? So you can think of all these different processes that have happened, which I will summarize in a minute. But we have to realize that this is only 0.15% of the history of the biosphere. So very, very recent. Most of the history of the biosphere has been without humans. So what we see around us today is the result of a transformation of the biosphere for human action in a very, very short period of time. So let's summarize that here now. So what did humans do? This is when we start, let's say 2.5 million years ago, BP means before present, people started making tools and in that way also influencing the biosphere. But all animals also make tools in one way or the other. So that was not uniquely human, but it did have biospheric consequences. And then we think about 1.5 million years ago. That may have been the beginning of the domestication of fire by humans. That was something that no other animal had ever done before, ever. So this is something uniquely human, as my former supervisor, the Dutch sociologist Jo Goudsblom always emphasized, that it is very different from what animals have done and in consequence sets us apart. And I think also he argued along those lines, and I totally agree with that. This, I think you can say, this is where the Anthropocene started. This is where humans started to do things that had not happened before in the biosphere's history. And you can also see that if you start thinking in biospheric epochs instead of ecological epochs, and this is just a quick summary of, let's say, the history of the biosphere during the history of humanity, then you don't have a problem how to define it. While, as we may all have seen, that very recently the proposal to define it as a geological epoch was struck down. It's very hard to define it as such because we don't have any markers yet that indicate it in any rocks. But if you think in terms of biospheric epochs, then it's very easy to define. So I think that is probably what we should do. All argued in the book, of course. And then only some 12,000 years ago, depending on your definition, people start practicing agriculture, which means extracting more solar energy than before from the land. Before that, they gathered, they hunted, they fished, and they burned the land and tried to adapt it to their needs, including, for instance, clearing land so that they would attract animals that they could hunt, or they could cook meals and all of things. All this biospheric effects, but let's say the agrarian revolution really transformed the surface of the earth and is still doing that. And it's an ongoing process. And I think especially in Brazil, you're all aware of that process because it may be one of the last areas on the planet where this process is taking place. And then at a certain point in time, it's only 6,000 years ago, it's just a tiny, tiny fraction of the history of the biosphere. People started creating their own food capturing pyramids, one could say, namely states where people no longer all work the land and extracted their energy from the land, but they extract it from other people or get it from other people, just like I get my salary on the bank. I'm not growing any crops really or holding any sheep or whatever. How does that work? And how was that possible? That you get suddenly such a social energy capturing pyramid. And then you could argue that 500 years ago, roughly, the continents were being connected for better or worse. I think I don't need to tell you that either in Brazil, because surely that the effects are enormous in your part of the world. But it was not only in Brazil, it happened all over the world, that not only, let's say, people were exchanged and people felt effects, but also plants and animals were becoming exchanged all over the world with basically whole ecologies transformed by human action, as Alfred Crosby pointed out in his famous books. And then we get the Industrial Revolution, very, very tiny portion of the history of the biosphere, but again, with extraordinary effects on the biosphere, transforming enormously, including its atmosphere and a little bit. And now we find ourselves in the information period, which again is transforming human societies, but also the biosphere. And we have extended, one could argue, the biosphere a little, at least temporarily, by going to the moon. And people are planning to go back. And we now have a space station circling the Earth. So the biosphere has become a little bigger, at least temporarily. And now we find ourselves in this situation today where, let's say, the information age is expanding with extraordinary also ecological efforts, not least because of the energy that it requires. And the funny thing is that most people think that the current situation is normal and that we need to fix nature a little here and there, and we have to do that. But I think if you think about it in a longer term perspective, as presented here, then you realize how absolutely abnormal the situation is. And that may help us to formulate better responses. And one of the responses I think is urgently needed, and those are my last words, is that it would be a good idea to start a string of biosphere institutes all around the planet where people study the biosphere in its entirety and understand what's going on, which could help us to formulate better answers to urgent questions. Well, thank you very much for your kind attention.
15 people, ne biçim bu ben? Yalan.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Now you have some time, exactly 30 minutes for questions and answers.
Yes, I have a question perhaps to Daniel Barreiros. Daniel, yes, actually, if we take major pandemics in the history of the world system, operational world system, since the start of the common era, if it actually the period which I spoke about also saw pandemics. It was Justinian plague. I just did not mention it, but it was a part of that climatic crisis of the 6th, 7th centuries before Common Era, because it did not touch very much Arabia, but I had no time to discuss this. But if we take Black Death pandemic, it was evidently associated with, actually that Justinian plague was associated with the late antique Little Ice Age. there was a little sort of little ice age in the 14th century. Next great pandemic, 17th century. Again, little ice age. No, one wonders with the Antonine Plague. Is it an exception not being associated with? Is it actually with cooling? All of them were associated with global cooling. Yes, and it might be not, but because those three pandemics were really most likely plague pandemics, but this is smallpox pandemics. What is the answer? Was it still associated with global cooling, or
Manyak mı bu herif be?
not really plague pandemics?
I think these processes they go hand in hand. You know, I was while we were making our presentation, I was just reminded. I told Daniel about the Justinian plague that was exactly happening the same time. Yeah. Yeah, it's really. I think it's really very difficult to decouple this cooling processes or heating processes and major pandemics. Because my last slide, I didn't show that because my time was running out. But before the great Antonine Plague, there was a surge of volcanic activity in Alaska and in Greenland, and there is a lot of evidence that cooling take place and all these aerosols prevented the solar radiation to come to Earth, and of course this has a direct impact on human health. So you can't decouple these things. Maybe it's the normal is that before a major outbreak like that, the Justinian Plague, the Antonine Plague, there was some major episode of cooling. So that's the thesis. Yeah, that's. Yes. Actually, that's the Kyle Harper's thesis about the fall of Rome. There's the association between cooling and the plague. Yeah. But yes, there's an association in the case of the Antonine Plague with global cooling as well.
I have a question to Daniel Ribera Vainfas. Yes. And also, Daniel, thanks for your bright presentation. Very interesting. And of course, there was a connection between global cooling and the rising of wool trading. But it seems to me that it better say not about the origin of capitalism, but about the origin of some conditions for capitalism, some predispositions for capitalism. No, because the early capitalism was in the 14th century in Flanders, in Italian republics, and England was speaking common modern language only the periphery of this capitalist development. Do you agree?
So here. Yeah. Oh, thank you for your question. Obviously, it is first of all a question of definition. What is capitalism? When I say in the presentation, I talk about the transition from feudalism to capitalism, and therefore I'm referencing the Marxist debate with Dobe, Sweezy, and all the guys. And they have a very strict definition of a change of the mode of production. And that is very important because it's the mode of production, not only of circulation. If you go on and to the Genoese and Venice and Flanders and all the Holland cities on the North Sea Basin, well, of course, we have a very strong argument for saying, well, they are capitalists as well, the capitalist cities. You can further extend the argument and say, well, the Greek cities in the ancient times were capitalist as well. The commerce in the Mediterranean before Rome was capitalist. You can identify those elements, of course, and they have their own history. When I focus on England, it is because it's the first major experiment in capitalism. It's like tens of thousands of millions of people under this new mode of production. Of course, they're not inventing something entirely new. They have a sort of dialogue with the Holland cities that were also, say, experimenting with that kind of capitalism. I do agree, there were something different there. Flanders and Amsterdam and the 18th century Holland was something different than feudalism in even the Baltic circuit in the 12th century. That word system that Abu Lugoy describes, the trade between the big European cities, they were in a sense capitalists. But what England does there, I believe it's a bit different, because when you start to subject an entire society, an entire country to that mode of production, it's something new. There's something new happening there, but of course it's never entirely new. It's always in a dialogue with other societies at the time. Did I answer you? Was it?
Just to understand, but are you going to say that, for example, in 15th century, the scale of capitalist production was in England was larger than in Italy? In Italy, in Florence, in the 15th century, you had already full-scale workers' rebellion. It turned out that there are lots of production, quite capitalist. Was there anything comparable to Italy really in 15th century, to capitalist production in Italy really in 15th century in Britain? My mind, it was, Britain still was a group in comparison.
Yes.
There was much larger capitalist production in Italy than in Britain.
Of course. Britain was the...
Just immediately after the events which you were discussing.
Britain was, of course, the periphery of this world. It was very small, it was very poor. It was, in many senses, insignificant. Of course, you can never expect the sheep raiser in the east coast of England to produce more in terms of value than a merchant in Venice. But what's happening in England is different than this merchant in Venice, because this merchant in Venice is rich, because he's capturing the value of that's being produced in a feudal.
Scale production of textiles, etc. This high progress, and there was a rebellion of workers already in the century. Oh, yes, so it was not only trade, it was a capitalist production. Like scale capitalist production, there was nothing comparable to such capitalist production.
It is never just trade. It's never just trade. Trade can never exist without production. When I said I'm referencing the Marxist debate of transition, I am bringing the focus onto production, because the production in England at that time is, in a sense, more capitalist than the textile production in Venice. Not because of the scale itself. Of course, the value they're producing is bigger. They are richer. But they are richer because they are interacting with the feudal world around them. the feudal lords of Italy, the feudal lords in the Mediterranean, even the non-feudal lords of the Arab world. All this circuit of trade is feeding into the richness of the Venice merchant. He is capitalist, he's very rich, but he's not in itself, it's not in itself a system of production as the sheep raiser in Eastern England. The petty nobility of England is not the pinnacle of capitalism expression in that time. He's not the richest, he's not the most interesting, he's not the most developed. It is a backwater country with backwater nobility, but they are doing something in which sense that interests us, because they are shaping the entire society around them in a new way, which the merchant of Venice is not, so to speak. I believe that's the
No, I understand what, maybe I understand what Daniel wants to say. He thinks that in England we can see a wide base of new kind of production. That's that because contrary on Flanders or Italy, capitalism in England was based on agrarian production. So there's no end a great deal of population that's was involved in this production. But I still want to point out that 14th century is too early to say about capitalism, maybe about the transition to capitalism. But it's true because in the 14th century, England exported mostly raw wool, and there was even then the king's law about that forbidden to export raw wool. But later, for example, in 16th century, yes, we see the really very wide basis for capitalism. Maybe it was no capitalism of people, because as I knew that in the 17th century, 2/3 of population were involved in manufacturing. Thank you.
Sim, sim.
Você tem, é que a gente está com a hora meio avançada.
Yes, we don't have time for other question. Maybe you can continue after the dinner.
Yeah, we can talk more at the dinner.
Now, thank you for the presentation. And now you have 15 minutes for a breakfast, a coffee break before the second block of presentations after the coffee break. Okay.